Well, I wish I could figure out how to do the background, but instead you have my fancy green screen. But first time out of the gate here is a charm. Hi, Sheereen.
Hi, V. How
So
are you?
nice. Good, good. Nice to see you again. We had a really good little prep call, so I feel like I know you a little bit better, but I do know you as having so much information for today that is going to be really interesting to share. And I want to do two things before we toss it over to you. I'm a writer, so I like to tell them what we're going to tell them. And so today I want to share that what we're going to talk about will sort of have a flow. We'll talk about your definition of DEI, the value of that for business in general, specifically how DEI fits into our media and marketing landscape, or of course should fit in. We're going to offer some specifics that everyone watching can and should apply so that all boats rise, from content creation to ad strategies. So Sheereen, with that, I know you have something special for us to see. Do you want to explain?
Absolutely. And thank you for that setup. I have the privilege and honor and true responsibility of supporting the great original brand innovator, I think, and visionary Miss Winfrey on the Oprah Winfrey Network, and her intentionality around creating really inclusive stories that support and reflect our audiences with integrity and authenticity. And most of our audiences that are showing up and joining in for our primetime viewership and original programming are Black women between the ages of 25 and 54. And as we talked about on coming on off the heels of 2020 and all of the challenges from a social justice perspective, but overall the long-term epidemic of the erasure of Black women and honestly Black subjects in story across all of our mediums, Ms. Winfrey had a call to action. It was a call to action to normalize our lives and our truths in the stories that we see, as we so do at OWN. So this was from last year when we spoke with the ANA around the launch of our See Her platform, which we will be sharing the byproduct of that great relationship with everyone that's on this call today. Without further ado, I kick it over to Ms. Winfrey, who says it best, and we'll touch base right after.
We're at an inflection point in this country. Black lives, seen in media and entertainment, need to be more than ever reflected with accuracy, with authenticity, and with integrity. We know this at OWN, and we've been living this intention since our inception. But there is an undeniable power that brands have to influence thought and consumer consciousness. And we have a responsibility to use the right language and, most important, the right imagery. It's always been important and now crucial to bring diverse voices and perspectives to all audiences. We need to honor the social responsibility of seeing and reflecting the experiences of all our viewers and consumers around the country. And to demonstrate respectability and be intentional in what you are showing. That's my favorite principle for living and for working. What is your truest intention? So I challenge you to normalize Black families, Black women, Black men, Black children, queer Black people, their hopes, their aspirations, their dreams as home buyers, as car owners, as dinner preparers, as moviegoers, to see the range of hues and hair textures as you celebrate beauty products and hair care. For all the research and resources required to put together a campaign, think about adding a new objective. Leverage your power and media time to rewrite and reimagine the American story, the full American story, where Black life is portrayed based on facts over stereotypes, where Black men are seen as dreamers and are engaged as active fathers, where Black families take road trips. We like road trips. Where Black women go for jogs. We like to jog. And Black life is normalized because we are so normal. And the common denominator in our normalcy, we love, we hope, we dream, just like all people do. So I appreciate your commitment to showing up for your clients, your viewers, and communities in a more authentic way that better represents us all. Thank you.
Phenomenal. So before we actually dive into that and sort of parse out some of that inspiration from Ms. Winfrey, I do want to start. She talked about using the right words, and I will be using the pronouns she, he. And I should also say that our skew and talking points are primarily going to reference the target audience of OWN and the Oprah Network, which is Black women. But our conversation, of course, is applicable to multiculturalism and diversity overall. And so with that said, welcome Sheereen again.
Thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here, and I'm just delighted. Obviously, as you mentioned, we had an opportunity to connect earlier last week, but I feel like this conversation is a critical one, and one that I hope really will reverberate and resonate, and that everyone that's participating and listening or listens thereafter outside of the live moment has key takeaways that provide for real implementation, as well as real thought leadership and adding to the thought equity around the conversations that are happening in their respective offices and projects, as well as in their own households, quite frankly.
Well, again, having spoken to you a little bit before, I know that you have some very specific takeaways, but let's start all about you.
Yeah.
It's all about Sheereen right now, because you've had a pretty stellar career. You have sort of 2 titles, 2 million areas of responsibilities, let alone you're raising 2 sons. You do everything from educate marketers and create data-driven solutions. You drive ad sales across both OWN Network and Oprah.com. And you inspire intersectionality in content for both advertisers and the network itself. Holy moly, I think we need to bottle you. So
So great for you to say thank you.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about some of your stops along the way, but how that also led you to personally really want to embrace and evangelize DEI a little bit more?
Absolutely. So, one of the unique things about my story and my history is I started off in media, truly sort of the legacy of my dad, who gave me my first job in high school, and he was in the newspaper business. And so I quickly learned how incredible the media platforms are to just inform agenda and conversation and drive dialogue, and really just sort of an information tool that would lead to me having an internship eventually with Time Magazine. It then led to a career in marketing, where I migrated from Time to Sports Illustrated, then eventually into television and the digital space at Viacom, where I worked closely on MTV and all of our properties there, MTV2, MTVU, and then begin to expand beyond that with VH1 and a few of the other networks. And then I got the call in 2016 to join OWN, and I was delighted to come and really did not know what to anticipate nor what to expect. But I had recognized that OWN was migrating into a place of content that was really rich and inspiring. And what occurred to me was, prior to joining OWN in 2016, where I would look up and be a part of a network pretty much, operated, managed, led, curated by that of a Black woman, my entire 16 years prior to that, when I started my career, I had often assimilated in every room, EB, wanting very much to fit into the space, feeling as though my Southern heritage, my nuance of being a Black woman raised in the South, the accent, the lack of information and access that I had in many ways made me feel inferior. And also, quite frankly, to look to the left and the right and around the room and never see anyone who really reflects your specific identity. There was this sense of pressure, I think, that I put on myself, in a sense of that I must fit into the space rather than the face fit, or make the space fit around me, and bringing in my full expression myself. So I often say that, I came out at OWN, and I came out as a Black woman, fully expressed, fully comfortable being myself, because prior, none of the environments really allowed me to feel that voice and full expression was celebrated, reflected, and truly respected in the actual stories and the conversations that we were curating and developing on the platforms where I worked.
So at that time, did you see anyone else doing the kind of content that you saw at OWN?
No, And I like to believe that OWN was very much a pioneer. There were a few places, let me just say that, there was some premium rich storytelling that you would see on some premium partners like an HBO, for example. But in the space of ad-supported cable, no, there was not an intentionality where every show that you saw coming in was bringing in this really rich, thoughtful ensemble of Black cast members, both in nonfiction as well as unscripted, as well as scripted. And it really began with the arrival of Mr. Tyler Perry, and then migrating to that of what we would see with Ava DuVernay and the creators around Greenleaf, and then what we did with the creators around David Makes Man. So all of this rich storytelling was reflecting a nuance and a specificity of the Black experience in a way that did not lean into the existing tropes that existed, that did not perpetuate the negative stereotypes that often become dangerous in real life for folks to deal with. But what we heard from our audiences, which I personally could experience, was that, wow, there has been such a dearth and scarcity of my stories with all of the richness, with all of the layers, textures, range, and expanded representations of the Black experience in one particular show, one particular narrative with showing range. But then you put an ensemble of shows together and have this really rich portfolio. And I believe that's what Ms. Winfrey does, as she often does, which is lead the conversation, start the movement. Because now you look up, that is not the case. We are not a bit of an anomaly. And that right now, more and more, which is a great thing, something we welcome, more and more networks and platforms are developing a richness of stories that reimagine the Black experience through a lens of accuracy and authenticity.
Well, in continuing to set the stage as you just did with the ecosystem 5 years ago, and as we change today, I do want to do what we promised, which is continue to set the stage by defining DEI itself. I know that it feels intuitive. We've all heard that, but I do have to say that we've made a little bit of progress by evolving from DNI to now call it DEI. And Deloitte did an equity study a few months ago, and they said diversity and inclusion are key to our future, but equity is about the measurable results of how to fight system bias and racism. So everybody has their personal anecdotes or descriptions, analogies is the best word of what DEI means. How do you describe it, and what does it mean in business?
Here's how I describe it, and we talked about this before, and it's not unique to me nor original, but it to me so personifies what that equity is all around, which is, at the end of the day, diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion and equity is being asked to dance. And I take that, yes, and even step further and say it's the freedom. It's the freedom to be in the space, fully expressed in believing that as you are, your nuance, your aesthetic, your identity is received and it belongs. You belong where you are. And that there's a commitment to making you feel invited, included, and that you have ownership in the experience, and that your identity is, and that imprint is part of the ownership and will continue to be, and that you can influence. So taking that same analogy a little bit further, you influence the music that is played, you influence the food that is served, and more important, you feel as though your imprint on the dance floor as you're dancing is well received and celebrated. And that really, to me, is the evolution of where we need to become. And when people can feel fully free to show up in their full identity and expression, independent of, just as we talk about, race and heritage, but every identity and all of that intersectionality that comes together by way of orientation, by way of gender, by way of religion, full expression, and believing that you belong in the space is truly when we start to see things tip into a better direction.
I guess the good news is that we know that we need to do more. And there are a lot of stats. You and I talked about this, that we don't want to boil the ocean today. We have, 30, 40 minutes, and there's so much to talk about. But if we start with the reality check of what's going on in business and then move into how to fix that with, as Ms. Winfrey said, the power of media. So I want to throw a couple stats at you. Your journey and being an executive in media was not necessarily emblematic of a lot of Black women today. In the media industry, sadly, last year, although a lot of women left the workforce because of COVID, last year, there was a stat from She Runs It, their Diversity Best Practices Inclusion Index, that in the media and marketing industry, we only increased the number of Black people in our space by 5%. Last year, it was 13%. The good news is that those elevated to the executive office of Black people overall was 28% within our industry. So there's that, but how do we continue to source, hire, and embrace more people of color in media and marketing?
It's a great question, and it's a critical question, right? So as we've talked about before, I'm in ad sales. I think I can count on one hand, EB, within the entire landscape of the industry, how many people look like myself in leadership positions across our industry, which is tragic and sad on many levels. But I believe at the end of the day, there's obviously coming off of the hills of last year, and that stat makes a lot of sense, right? People felt this urgency. How do we populate our boards with more people of color? How do we diversify our leadership positions? And there was a sense of that we right now are being measured, and we want to be thoughtful about how we show up in the world. The truth of the matter is that works for a moment, right? And you start to see the pivot swing a bit, but to sustain that, there has to be metrics of accountability, and there has to be a consistent sense of pressure industry-wide that says, what are you doing to create for opportunity? And more importantly, it can't just be opportunities at the entry-level positions. It has to be in the space of leadership, influence, and those who really have an imprint on the fabric of culture, in addition to the work that's performed, as well as the content and the stories that are released into the world, and more importantly, those who represent the trading desk and those who are trading on the media and evaluating where marketers should show up. And so, this is challenging to say, but I think it's right now until it becomes human natural behavior where everyone is moving through with that ethos and that understanding of how critical diversity, how much it benefits business, quite frankly, there should be incentive. And more importantly, I think some organizations have put that into place. And sadly, penalty, and not necessarily punitive in the sense of if you don't have people of color or women of color in position, but that there's an acknowledgement and there's a reporting that demonstrates where you lack. Because only then do I think really you get the urgency from C-suite and senior level management to put truly commitment to having the inclusion that's required.
Right, and that also impacts vendor, supply chain, et cetera. So hire diversely throughout the organization, and then find ways to welcome diverse talent in and offer that inclusive feel, being invited to dance in different ways.
And can I just compliment that by saying, EP, and it's good for business. As I'm advising marketers and working with them on ideas and solutions, I remind them the universal, in many instances, when it comes to just capitalism and business, we all speak the language of green, which is that bottom line being at the end of the day, one where we're seeing the dollars increase. When you begin to speak to this audience, and more importantly, if you speak to this audience with sensitivity, awareness, and authenticity, they recognize that the right people are in the room to get it right. And by design, you get a vote not only in their confidence, but by the sense of where they show up with their consumer dollar. And that is critical. And we recognize that that's important to you in growing revenue, but also resonance with consumers and communities. Then you must begin to recognize that the investment in the room with the people that represent all of these unique different demographics really supports you showing up properly, accurately, and thus having the credibility to trade on for the purposes of your growth and advancement.
Yes. And I definitely want to talk about the opportunities that speaks to for advertisers, which again is one of your million areas of responsibility. But I want to go back to in terms of the power of media, which you sort of implied with offering diverse perspectives, content, faces, etc. And I'm going to read this because I thought that video was so powerful. So Ms. Winfrey said, media has a responsibility to influence thought and consumer consciousness. She says to us in the room, right? We're media, we're marketers, leverage your power and media time to rewrite and reimagine the American story, the full American story where Black life is portrayed on facts over stereotypes, and show up for your clients, your viewers, your communities. So I think that you guys did a survey that I read about how Black women feel they're being portrayed, and the challenge of tropes or stereotypes. Can you talk a little bit about that survey?
Absolutely. So we have been in the marketplace and with our consumer audiences, quite often communicating with her, surveying her, polling her to understand what's important and what she wants to see as it relates to the narratives that we create. You come off of 2020 and you think about Black women being disproportionately impacted by the implications of COVID and how it was affecting her community. More importantly, the many new facets of working from home on top of caregiving and those responsibilities that she was looking to manage. And then beyond that, just a sense of just feeling depleted and exhausted when you layered on top of that, the social justice movement and the sense of seeing someone like Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, all within a matter of like 90 days, which, while not new to her experience in this country, just felt like on top of a time where she was already under so much pressure and emotionally fatigued, this would also happen, which then creates for a level of more lack of security for her family, for her children, and for herself. And it was just an emotional overload and, quite frankly, traumatic. And she still had to show up in her community, in her office spaces, in her household, bearing the responsibility. So as we talked to our audience, over 10,000 women, about that experience and how that was reinforcing as well as redefining how she wanted to see herself in story, what came out is that she wanted to be in a place where she could see herself celebrated, rewarded, loved, honored. She wanted joy, because at the end of the day, the news media, on top of what she was seeing in a lot of her familiar stories, were no longer satisfying her and giving her the retreat and delight that she needed. And she wants to be reminded, quite frankly, about the things that she knows will instill hope. And that is seeing her love, seeing romance show up in her household with honesty and accuracy, seeing drama, but drama that is scripted for the purposes of delight and escape, as opposed to stereotypical unscripted drama that only promotes more shameful consumption of stories about herself. So guilt-free enjoyment. She wants to be unburdened. She wants to watch with delight and retreat and escape, but also knowing that part of that escape is into her absolute truth, and that the stories that we share rather, reflect that absolute truth and give her the sense of she's loved, she's seen, she's respected, and she's celebrated here.
A whole person.
A full whole person, yes.
One interesting thing that I read also is that there is such a trope of portraying the Black woman as the strong Black woman. And, you think, oh, that's great. But what one of the quotes in your study said was that vulnerability is what makes people relatable. Like when I couldn't get my green screen up, vulnerability makes people relatable. And there's a lack of content that features the vulnerability of Black women. What does that do for promoting stereotypes? How do you break out of that? How do you advise content creators and even brand advertisers in developing imagery of women properly?
To answer that question, I think we have to think about the Black woman and her arrival since she first stepped foot on soil into this country, right, by her captors, and more importantly, in an institution of being enslaved. From her arrival, she was here to be in service to everyone else. Her strength and her resilience oftentimes is what allowed her to get through the ridiculous genocide that she was living through, right, in this country. So combine that with the evolution in generation after generation. She's often been seen as this monolithic, strong figure, almost superlative to that of the human experience. Oftentimes I would hear, even in the space of like the health industry, that a Black woman will be denied pain meds because there's a sense of she's got the strength and her body can withstand more pressure, more pain, and thus be subjected to less resources for support and recovery. So that is a universal narrative that we must dismantle, but the way that shows up in story oftentimes, unfortunately, the way Black women have had to also operate is believing the circumstances and the situations that I find myself in, I have the perseverance, the tenacity, and the strength to get through this because I have no other choice. And that has been my story since, as I mentioned, my origins here. So it's critical that in telling story, if we're going to normalize and humanize the experience for everyone, well, those emotions of fatigue, those emotions of vulnerability, those experiences of pain are real. And to be able to show that emotional and mental imprint of trauma and stress and those feelings around it, afford her a space, and I apologize for the noises that are happening outside right now, but they afford her a space of comfort, of seeing herself in those spaces and knowing it does not diminish her full self. It does not diminish the resilience that is part of the human experience, but it allows her to see herself being told and reflected with the truth of the challenges that she's experiencing. And what we like to do is also create some delight and some wonder around that, and the idea that she can also recover and evolve, but we have to start in the place of truth. And, I once heard a quote that said, Black women are often thought of last, but who everyone comes to first, for the purposes of creating for resolution, for moving forward an election, for moving forward things that need to get done. And so at OWN, we like to say to her, you are first. And when you come here, we're creating a place for you to see yourself and delight in that, but also see your full truth and the full range of your experience.
So 2 quick things, because I want to, I told you we were going to boil the ocean. There's so much to talk about, but what you've done at OWN is you are, as you said, kind of have pioneered this space. You've created an ecosystem that enables women to be seen, Black women to be seen authentically and without stereotypes in every hue and every hair texture, et cetera. So that in and of itself is a guide, but you also created an actual guide, which is amazing. It's so comprehensive. And I'm going to have to take a sip of coffee because I got all choked up at the last thing you said. So I'll let you talk about this 5-page guide.
Absolutely. So, we work with marketers all of the time, maybe, and a lot of times they'll come to us and say, we have a campaign, we want to reach audiences, and we want to more importantly, we want to connect with Black women, and we want to, as we recognize, they're the CEOs of the household, they're the leaders of community, they're driving forward conversation and business, as well as really just as a collective moving forward culture and conversation. How do we tap into that in a meaningful way? And more importantly, how do we do it without getting canceled because we do it the wrong way? And I often say it first starts with, where are you pulling from? Who's in the room that can influence that imprint? And do you respect and listen to that individual or individuals for the purposes of allowing their actual Indigenous experience to drive the way you think about the conversation, the audience? But more importantly, if you don't, and you're looking to reach this consumer, you need a partner who can stand in the gap for you, a partner who is very much rooted in this insight, expertise, and can help you show up properly, accurately, and correctly, and more importantly, without offense or disrespect to the intended consumer that you're looking to connect with. And so what we've done is we want to really empower marketers with this tip sheet that we partnered with See Her. Dr. Natoki Ford helped lead with us, in addition to working with many of our storytellers, from David Makes Man to the teams from Array, Miss Ava DuVernay's team. And we said, what do we do to get it right? How do we lean into the right storytelling? And what questions should every writer's room have, and every creative team be utilizing to say, did we get it right? Did we think about these things? Or did we lean into familiar and accessible tropes that actually continue to perpetuate those various stereotypes that we're looking to migrate away from? So this document asks everything around range and texture to how we show up from a gender representation point of view. Are we reflecting the queer experience with authenticity and accuracy? Black women, when it comes to their romances and their loves, does she appear in one way? Even if you're talking about a woman in a space of career, how does that show up? What role, what titles is she showing? And so This is a fabulous tool. We
It
hope that
is.
everyone will continue to use it because it's thoughtful. And then more importantly, continue to engage with our teams when building creative. I will tell you, we had a conversation with a partner who will remain nameless just a few weeks ago, a couple days ago rather. And in the spirit of being in service, not only to our audience, but to that partner, we had to say there were things about your RFP that did not work, that already were laden and dripped in bias. And knowing that, it's an acknowledgement. It's so critical that you have a partner, a credible partner at the table to help you mitigate what you already implied within the RFP. So, and that was an interesting conversation, but we also knew that we had to do that. And while some things may have felt offensive and challenging, even for me to consume, I realized that if I'm doing what I'm saying that I'm doing, and I'm helping to promote change and move forward the conversation, then I recognize that I am a change agent and I have to be an activist on behalf of our audience. And I have to call out when something is not right and help make right what's wrong for the purposes of really supporting moving forward the narrative. And that's what See Her and our partnership around with the ANA and this tip sheet does. So we're going to provide this tip sheet to everyone and it'll be available in the chat. And again, I really hope that everyone will utilize it and keep it close.
It's so good and it's so thought-provoking. And I know that you, as you said, not just in RFPs, but sometimes you have a seat at the ad creative table. Is that right? And can guide and advise on best practices with good advertising creative.
100%. And we like to leverage, as I mentioned, we talk to 10,000 women annually as part of our research panel, and Black women specifically tell us. And we recognize it looks different regionally. And by way of just age demographics, there's different points of sensitivity that we're learning about, but more importantly, we're careful. And the same information and data that we're using to influence how we're going to tell our stories, we really make that available to our partners and say, let's help you get it right. What's the story that you're really looking to tell? More importantly, what do you want your audience to feel and engage with? And one of the things I'll often tell you, EB, is that marketers and partners chase ratings over meaningful and safe engagement. And if that becomes the metric on with which you trade and you're only going to chase rating points, which again, we recognize scale is important, but sometimes you can find yourselves in environments that continue to support the limited range and experiences and reflections of the Black female experience in this country. And so we're often mindful to say to partners, it's not just about the creative that we build with you, it's about where that creative shows up and where are you investing and what type of experience do you want to evoke when you're talking to your consumer based on the environment of where your short form and your content shows up.
So staying on that advertising track for a second, so this is a big question. What role does big data play in accurate or inaccurate representation and finding diverse consumer groups? I know you have some thoughts on that.
I do. And here's the bottom line. Big data is flawed because at the end of the day, if the folks who are soliciting the information don't have a sensitivity and awareness about even some of the questions and the way with which the data is solicited, again, you can perpetuate the bias and the misrepresentation, because in fact, you're writing and developing, and we've heard this quite often, but in the algorithms and the information that's gathered, who's setting that up? And who's soliciting that information? And is there an implication or a narrative that they already are aware of, or that they believe or subscribe to themselves that influences how the information shows up? So on some level, we still have to be discerning and thoughtful about the sources of where that data comes from. And more importantly, asking more questions about the solicitation of information, how many people of color, how many Black women specifically were reviewed. And then there's, within the Black experience, right? There's this diaspora. So there's the Black American experience, but then there's also at the end of the day, the nuances and specificity associated with that of the Black Caribbean experience, that of someone who identifies their origin specifically with being in Africa and how that shows up. And so we have to be thoughtful and sensitive to that and not, again, group everyone into one particular bucket and assume that becomes the overall data source and points for how we trade and move and develop our content.
So there are so many studies about the value of brands who embrace DEI and ESG and things like that. But it also seems intuitive that OWN and Oprah clearly do well by doing good, but you're also part of Discovery overall. And I know that you guys have done some really great initiatives that helps you walk the talk. Can you talk about the company overall and advice for how people connect the dots from DEI to doing well?
Absolutely. So we launched this platform called Mosaic, and Mosaic has touch points across our entire organization Discovery, from the hiring practices and the retention of people that we bring in that are underrepresented audiences, in addition to diversity in our suppliers and those with whom we're securing content from and developing content with. I mentioned Ava DuVernay, but we're doing a multitude of things with Will Packer and his team across Food Network, in addition to OWN. And that's just one example. But beyond that, even more when it comes to diversity supplier initiatives, who else are we looking to employ and bring in for the purposes of the different services that we do? And then our C-suite invested a significant amount of money into each of the networks having access to additional resources to tell more rich, diverse stories that go beyond what they're presently required to do in the purposes of engaging with their audiences and giving them room and range to take risk and tell more.
I'm sure that you shared your guide with all of your sister networks.
Of course, it is definitely part of our intranet portal, and more importantly, something that we've celebrated internally. And we've continued, one of our key partners within our organization who also helped set this up, Portia McCoy, was also very helpful in organizing our MCA, which is our Multicultural Association, which comes together, and we have these MCA Mondays, and we have dialogue, we have conversation. It's a candid, safe space for all of the employees to collectively talk about the change we wish to see both within the organization as well as our content, and then the larger universal sort of landscape. So it's been great. And as we continue to evolve, I think we'll continue to do the very same. So in our new world, if you will.
We can go on and on and on, and that sounds like a cliche, but it's so true. But just to leave it on sort of a fun and high note, water cooler chat during COVID was replaced by, so what are you watching? So I'm going to ask you, on or off? All right, how about off OWN? What are you watching?
So that's interesting, because I really do drink the Kool-Aid and love our content, and Saturday nights have become, and Friday are for co-viewing for both my husband and I, sort of our escapes when it comes to what we're watching on OWN and live television. But what I will say is we have started watching Handmaid's Tale, and that has been all too eerily close to a lot of the realities that we're seeing take place. So it feels like more of a horror for me right now than it does an actual place of unburdened entertainment. But I am consuming it because I think it's such rich storytelling. In addition to that, we are also Succession. I feel Succession so influences our day-to-day in my industry, and feels like I sort of live in Succession in the sense of watching the industry and all the conversation and vernacular, which is inspiring. And then Insecure, love Issa Rae and everything that she represents.
Yes.
But a full circle moment for us in collective viewing in our household. As you mentioned, we have two sons, a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. I grew up watching Wonder Years in my household with my dad and my sister. And now I get to watch it with my husband and my 2 sons, and seeing it reimagined through the lens of a Black family is just so rich and so beautiful. So that's sort of our short list of content we're watching right now.
What a great list, and inspiring. And David, hello. I know you're back on. I need another 40 minutes, please.
It's the worst part of my job. I hate interrupting these amazing conversations, but I will say we will have you back for part 2. I mean, we have to. There's so much more to get into, and this was so inspiring and powerful. So I really appreciate both of you taking time to share with us in our community today.
Delighted to be here.
Thank you.
And thank you for doing this. Thank you for keeping the conversation alive and well. And EB, I look forward to us getting together in person and continuing the dialogue as well.